we have the Shadow Treasurer, Ted O'Brien, who joins me on this Wednesday night on Money News. Ted, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you, Scott.
Ted, firstly, what was your reaction to the decision by the RBA to keep rates on hold? Like, do you think they made the wrong decision even though it was 6-3?
Look, to be honest, I'll probably keep away from doing a commentary on the RBA, given their independence is really sacrosanct. I think what Jim Chalmers and the Labor Party would like to see is everybody pointing the finger at the RBA. But in truth, they're making decisions based on the state of the economy, and no one's more responsible for the bad state of the economy than the Albanese government. But to put it in context, you have, as a result of the rates being kept on hold, average mortgage holders continuing to pay $1,900 extra every single month for additional interest payments on their loans since the Labor government came to office. So that continues. They're hoping to get relief. I think Jim Chalmers was hoping to do a press conference to take credit for a reduction in the cash rate. But of course, it didn't eventuate. And his hope is everyone points the finger at the RBA. But the real problem here is the government.
I'll come back to those interest rate increases in a moment. But on the positive front, Australia has maintained a remarkably low unemployment rate while bringing down inflation and increasing wages and reducing rates. Now, does that mean that you can concede that Jim Chalmers is doing a good job?
Unfortunately, I can't. And that is because if you start looking underneath the bonnet of those stats you just mentioned, employment has been kept low, and yes, that's a good thing. But over the last 2 years, 80% of new employment has come from the non-market sector. This reflects Labor's approach, which is all about big government spending. So over that same period of time, Commonwealth government spending has increased by 17%. So the thing that's really been keeping the economy, it's stagnated, but at least it hasn't gone completely backwards, is your taxpayer dollars. In order for wages to be sustainably going up in real terms over time, it can't be done by that. It's got to be done by productivity. And what we have seen is a drop of over 5% in productivity.
Now, when you talk about big government spending, you're talking about a lot of public servants, which Anthony Albanese has promised may not keep their job. But the problem we also have is the confidence that small to medium business have in the private sector in employing, and we still have a significant labour shortage. What would the coalition do about that if you're in government?
Well, ultimately, what we've seen in the last few years is because the Albanese government has prioritised the public sector, that is government, over the private sector, like you mentioned, small businesses and the like, it means the public sector is crowding out the private sector. In other words, it is scooping up a whole bunch of resources, whether that's human resource, capital, investment, where an economy can grow over a long period of time successfully. It has to be driven by the private sector. Now, that means that if you actually deal with issues of productivity, so you make it, you create incentives for businesses to invest, for investors to come into Australia and put their money in. You build our capabilities, not just human capital, but technology. You make it more flexible in terms of industry, the ability for people and capital to move around. All of these things are what the Liberal Party believes in. That is what drives an economy.
Well, what pie has been cut has been the inflation pie, and that's why I was so surprised by the RBA keeping rates on hold at 3.85% yesterday. But what would the coalition government do to bring inflation lower?
It all comes down to government spending. And the governor of the RBA has been clear on this. Her predecessor was also clear on this. The reason why inflation has stayed higher for longer in Australia is because it has been homegrown. And that means it's coming from within Australia. So you can talk about Trump, you can talk about Ukraine, you can talk about a whole bunch of things, but this is homegrown. And what's growing inflation, what's keeping prices up, is a spending spree by the Albanese government. When government keeps spending and it's not on productive activities, inflation stays high. So that is why you've seen comparable economies like in Europe, Canada, closer to home, New Zealand. You've seen post-COVID multiple rate cuts, interest rate cuts, starting up to about 8 months before we saw our first. Why? Because they didn't have the same blowout in government spending.
So you've made it very clear, and you've said it publicly, that the priority of the government has not been productivity. Jim Chalmers has invited you personally to a productivity roundtable. I think it's in about a month. So will you be attending, and what will be your suggestions to boost productivity in that meeting?
Well, firstly, yes, I will be attending. In terms of, my comments in those meetings, I probably won't flag them ahead of time. I hope you'd understand. But I am happy to make one recommendation ahead of time. If the government is fair dinkum about improving productivity in this country, it should dump its plan to tax unrealised capital gains through its new superannuation tax.
Okay.
The super tax is super big, it's super bad, and it is actually anti-aspiration, anti-productivity, anti-economic growth. If they're fair dinkum about this before that round table, it would be a welcome sign if the Treasurer dumped that very, very foolish tax idea.
I don't think that's going to happen, Ted. I seriously don't think it's going to happen. I think it's highway robbery. And again, for those listeners who don't understand, if you have a self-managed super fund worth more than $3 million, which I know a lot of regional Australians have assets in businesses and farms that do not have the liquidity to be able to pay what is known as an unrealised capital gain. So if your farm's worth $10 million, you could be up for a $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 tax bill by doing nothing. And that is exactly what you're talking about, isn't it, Ted?
Yeah, it is. And you use the example of a farmer, right? And so I was talking about this with one of my colleagues earlier today about a farmer, I think 64 years of age, looking at generational change, wanting to, hand the farm over to the kids. The farm sort of valued, they think, around about $3.5 million. But they just keep farming. The value of the land goes up. And under Labor's plan, now they've got to pay the ATO tax. So where do they get the cash from? They don't have any cash.
There's no cash. There's no liquidity.
Yeah, exactly. They own a farm, yes, and yep, that's valued, but they don't have the cash. So what do? They sell the farm?
No, there's no buyer.
So they can pay the ATO. This is the sort of thing that they're doing. And once they do this to farmers, once they starve the younger Australians from seed capital to fund startups, which is what's going to happen too, right, through this thing, all they're going to do, it's a tax grab, they will then spread this tax of unrealised capital gains, so the tax on theoretical profits, to other classes of assets. So it won't just be super funds. It'll be other assets, other investments, because they're on a spending spree, they haven't got the money to pay for it, and therefore they're coming after the money that Australians have earned for themselves.
Now, we're going to talk about tariffs later on in the show, but obviously it was a big day today. Donald Trump didn't even know Peter Dutton's name after the election lost. What can the coalition guarantee, and how would you handle Donald Trump's situation in the government better than what seems to be taking place at the moment?
Well, number one, we would ensure that we meet with him. I mean, it's a pretty simple first ask. When you're talking about international diplomacy, when you're talking about our most important strategic ally,
yes,
relationships count. It is the foundation block. To think that the president has now been the president for 246 or so days, still our Prime Minister has not met him face to face. And with everything going on, whether it be tariffs, AUKUS, issues of defence that you mentioned before, for our Prime Minister to not have a face-to-face with the President of the United States is appalling. In fact, it's a national embarrassment. And as someone who has spent much of his business career overseas before politics, I tell you what, it really is an embarrassment to think how close we are to the United States, yet the Prime Minister hasn't even met the President. No wonder things are happening and we are not in a good position to negotiate favourable outcomes, the likes of which the United Kingdom has been able to do, because the Prime Minister just hasn't prioritised the relationship. That's just the starting point.
Shadow Treasurer Ted O'Brien, thank you so much for your insight and your knowledge on this Wednesday night here on Money News.